Hello, my name's Simon Swift, and I'm a lecturer in critical and cultural theory at the School of English in the University of Leeds. And the title of this podcast is a question: the distraction of autobiography? What are we doing when we read literary texts? It's long been argued by critics that the reading of novels and novels themselves became a popular form of leisure activity about 200 years ago in the course of the 18th century. This is a time when people like Daniel Defoe were publishing novels like Robinson Crusoe, which a number of critics have described as the first novel. But when you stop to think about it, it's pretty extraordinary that novels, which have always existed for pleasure, for leisure, as a form of leisure activity, can become a subject of academic study. That you can get an A-level or even a degree partly about the reading of novels. So what is it about novels that we think is important and worthy of study? Well, we might well think that novels can tell us a great deal about the world that they describe. We might think, for example, that a novel like Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, which I talked about in a previous podcast, can tell us a lot about the world of Britain in the 19th century. Or we might think that a novel like Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf can tell us a lot about post-war London, post-First World War London, what it was like to be alive in the first days after the First World War. So too, we might think that novels can tell us a great deal about the person who wrote them, about the author. Or, to invert that relationship, we might well think that finding out about the author can tell us a great deal about what's going on in the novel. I'm going to read to you now a quotation from a very famous French critic called Roland Barthes, a reader of literary texts, who wrote a very, very famous essay in 1968 called The Death of the Author. So I remember when I was a first-year undergraduate many years ago, going to a lecture about this essay, about the death of the author, and it literally blew my mind. I don't think I'd ever heard, in fact I'm pretty sure I'd never heard ideas like this before. And I went straight off to the library and devoured the essay. So if you're thinking of doing a degree in English and you want to read ahead, look ahead to the kinds of texts that you might be exposed to in your degree, this essay might be a really good place to start. It would be a good opportunity for you to get a sense of the kinds of things we do with students at degree level, the kinds of texts that we get them to read in order to encourage them to think outside of the box. So the title of this essay is very provocative and quite shocking: The Death of the Author. What on earth does Barthes mean by this title for his essay, The Death of the Author? Let's read a passage from the text and think about it. The author, when believed in, is always conceived of as the past of his own book. Book and author stand automatically on a single line, divided into a before and an after. The author is thought to nourish the book, which is to say that he exists before it, thinks, suffers, lives for it, is in the same relation of antecedence to his work as a father to his child. Now this seems to me to be a really interesting passage. It tries to look at what we might think an author to be, how we, as readers, imagine authors. And it also hints that we believe in the author, that there is a relationship of belief between reader and author, almost as if the author is some kind of godlike figure, a figure who requires or demands belief or faith. But at the same time, Barthes insists on the author pre-existing the book that he writes. And he wants to think of the author as a kind of a father figure, a giver of life, a nourisher, as if the author is the father and the book is the son or the daughter. Now, my job title at Leeds, as I said at the beginning of this podcast, is lecturer in critical and cultural theory. What this basically means is that my job is to get people to think carefully about the kinds of assumptions they might have about what literature is, about what it is to be a reader, or about what authors are in this case. My job is to get people to think about their assumptions, to bring to their awareness their assumptions about the reading and analysing of literature. So one of the first things that we come across, usually quite quickly, when I start teaching first years, is the idea of the author's intention. So if you take the example of Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, you might want to claim that Dickens wrote Great Expectations in order to think about the life of 19th century Britain. Or indeed, that he formed the character of Pip, the main protagonist of Great Expectations, in order to describe his own experience growing up in Britain in the early 19th century. This all seems fairly reasonable to me. These seem like reasonable, sensible things to say. There doesn't seem to be anything outrageous about these claims. There are 2 points I'd want to make about this idea of authorial intention, however. And I'll make the first point by thinking about myself as a writer. I write books and articles and essays. I don't write novels like Dickens. But in that sense, I am an author. Yet, and to be perfectly honest, I'm not entirely sure why I write books. Or rather, I'm not sure why it is that I write the kinds of books that I write. So if, as an author myself, I can't say for sure why it is that I write and why it is that I write the sorts of books that I do write, how on earth can I claim to be able to know why someone else writes books? Someone like Charles Dickens, for example. If I don't even know for sure my own intentions in writing, then how can I be sure about what other authors intended in their writing? In a sense, this is a point about language. We can all think of examples of slips of the tongue, Freudian slips, for example. Moments when you mean to say one thing and you say something else without realising it. Or indeed, and more simply perhaps, moments in which, by saying things out loud, we realise that they sound very different to the way that we thought they sounded when we said them to ourselves in our heads. You can think of this by analogy with your own experience. If you think about something that has made you feel very sad in your life in the past few years, it may well be the case that it's only really in talking about that experience to someone else that you've felt the sadness, that you've realised the depth of that sadness. And the same goes for happiness, of course. Sometimes if you tell a story, something that you remember happening to you that was very funny to someone else, you may find that you spontaneously burst out laughing. So in a sense, the point I'm making here is that we are not fully in control of our words, however much we may think that we are. Our words may tell us more about ourselves than we thought we knew. Now this may feel like a bit of a digression from the question of the author and from the question of authors in the 19th century, like Charles Dickens, for example. But in a way, in having this discussion, all the time we've been thinking about the idea of an author and reflecting on our ideas of what an author is. Who is this author who intended to describe the life of the 19th century in Great Expectations? Who is he? Are there not rather, perhaps, multiple authors of a novel like Great Expectations. Lots of authors of the novel. Certainly one of these authors would be the Charles Dickens, who was reflecting on his life and his childhood and using it as a source for the writing of his own novel. There was also the Charles Dickens, who wrote the novel because he needed to earn money to pay the bills. But maybe there are other authors that Charles Dickens didn't even know about, parts of himself that he didn't know that were speaking through his novel. And perhaps we too, as readers, are authors, in some sense, of Great Expectations. When Barthes talks about the author as the before of the book, when he talks about a line running from the author to the book, when he thinks about the author as cause of the book, as father of the book, he wants to question that line. He wants to disrupt it. He wants to encourage us to suspend the idea of the author as the before of the book. So maybe Charles Dickens, in writing Great Expectations, wasn't fully in control of the words. Maybe he's not fully the owner, the author of the meaning of those words, in ways that are really quite exciting for us as readers to think about. And this really is why I want us to think about this question of biography. And this is the second point I want to make now. Because once you've said that the author's intentions explain the meaning of the novel, what else is there for us as readers to do? Actually, I think that thinking about the author in this particular way closes off possibilities for us as readers of literary texts. It's almost as if you say, Charles Dickens wrote Great Expectations to describe the world of the 19th century or to talk about his own experience. The job's done, I can go home now. My work as a reader is finished. That seems to me to be very limiting and very boring and disappointing for us as readers. It's also worth bearing in mind that there is an etymological link. That's to say, a link on the level of the history of the meaning of the word between author and authority, which is to say that the author might be an authority figure, someone who polices the text, who wants to control its meaning, a father, says Barthes, or a god. And we as readers might want to challenge that authority, to think in exciting ways about how we can liberate the text from this idea of the author. Now, in saying this, I don't mean Charles Dickens, the man who sat down and wrote Great Expectations, was some kind of tyrant. I mean that the author is himself a kind of a fiction invented by readers in order to stop them from being able to do their job, to do the hard work of reading the text. And that this fiction is something that we as readers might want to challenge. So thinking about the death of the author opens up exciting possibilities for us as readers. And this is what Roland Barthes says at the very end of his essay, The Death of the Author. The birth of the reader must be at the cost of the death of the author. This is really quite an exciting and revolutionary claim that Barthes is making. In a way, he's saying that there have never really been readers, that the reader has not yet been born. So just as the author is a fiction invented to stop readers from doing their jobs, because readers haven't been able to do their job, there never really have been any readers. Just a final gloss on this idea, which is a complicated one, I think. I'm not doing anything more than introducing it to you in this podcast. I'm not expecting you to fully grasp it even. Just to provoke you to think about your own status as readers is the point of this podcast. And on that note, I think that what Barthes is doing in this essay is he's challenging us to be more active, more engaged, and more excited as readers. In a sense, he's challenging the laziness of a certain kind of reader. who thinks that their job is done as soon as they've attributed the meaning of the novel or the poem to its author. That's a very limiting thing for a reader to do or to say. It's much harder to think for ourselves once we get rid of the fiction of the author as the authority, the figure of authority that creates the text. We have to work much harder as readers to explain its meaning. But that also opens up exciting possibilities, an exciting sense of freedom for us as readers. So in a sense, reading after the death of the author is terrifying and exciting at the first time, much like the experience of being a first-year undergraduate at university. Thanks and happy reading.